Hey folks, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and as I promised, I am going to make this video to help you go over how you should write a method section. So I have a couple of things that will help you out with this. So I've pulled up the syllabus, and as you can see, your peer review of the very first method section draft is going to be due April 8th. Now remember that your first draft is always 0 points just because to kind of take the pressure off and just to kind of get you to write something down on paper with no pressure. Now, one thing that I will mention, and I will send a reminder out about this, we do not have class on Friday, April 9th, and per the guidance of Dr. Bangs and Dr. Weitzel, these days off from classes are meant to be recharge days, not only for you, but also for us. And so I am probably going to move homework number 8 to probably either Sunday or Monday. And Monday's probably more likely because I would like you to enjoy a 3-day weekend. So I am probably going to move that to Monday just to kind of make sure that I am not asking too much of you on a day when you are technically allowed to be recharging. So let's spend a little bit of time going over how to actually write a method section, and then I will also pull up some websites and some additional guidelines as well as our rubric to kind of show what I am looking for and what you can expect and what you can do to give me a very, very good method section. So I'll be completely honest, the method section is one of my favorite things to write. So anytime that I've had to write a paper of any kind, I always start with the method section. And part of the reason that I do that is compared to the introduction and the results and discussion, which are always going to change a little bit in terms of what results you find, what study you're looking at, what sources you're bringing in. The methods section, yes, it is going to be different for every single study that you do, but one of the things that's really cool is that regardless of what kind of study you're doing, the methods section always follows the exact same template. And we're going to go over how that kind of works. So let's talk a little bit about what's involved here. All right. So what is the method section? So the method section comes directly after your introduction or your literature review. And remember that I mentioned that generally what an introduction should do, it should be summarizing the literature on a particular topic. In this case, Craik and Lockhart's Levels of Processing Framework and the research that was done by Craik and Tulving in 1975 to support the Levels of Processing Framework. And then also additional studies that provide us with more information. Now, you're summarizing all of this literature, and remember that the goal of our study is to replicate the original findings from Experiment 9 in Craik and Tulving. So ideally, you have set up a problem or something that is missing, and now you have a study that is basically going to come in and address this issue. So you could say something like, many people have found replications of this effect. Many of the studies that I've included in this literature review have been able to replicate the effect. We wanted to see if we could do that too. And that's perfectly fine for framing it. So now that you've kind of set that up, you've summarized the literature, we've been very broad, remember that we're doing an hourglass structure. So remember that your introduction is supposed to be very, very broad. Now we're going into a very specific study. So our hourglass is starting to narrow. And now you are actually going to talk about how you did the study. So we're getting more specific. Now, something that you need to keep in mind and something that I will definitely be grading you on is that somebody who is reading your methods section should be able to set up your study, and they should be able to repeat it and replicate it based on what you write. So if you've had first year writing seminar and you've had discussions about different genres of writing, this is what we would call procedural writing. Your writing needs to be very clear. You cannot leave out details, and this is one of those cases where I would rather you be more detailed than less detailed. So let's talk about what this involves. So the methods section is often going to be divided into smaller subsections. In particular, we're going to focus on participants, apparatus or materials, and I will talk about the difference between the two, and then the procedure. You also need to make sure that you are including proper information in each section and also using APA appropriate headings. Okay. So let's start with the participants subsection. So this subsection is entirely devoted to the characteristics of people who participated in your study. So this might include information on age, if you have it. This might include information on gender, if you have it, as well as education levels. Ultimately, it depends on what you are looking at. Additionally, you are going to need to include how this sample of participants was selected. Are they representative of your population of interest? And as we've kind of talked about in class, this isn't always something that we do very well. So for example, in our replication study, this will actually be a convenience sample. Now, one of the things that's kind of nice is that we replicate this effect with convenience samples all the time. So it kind of suggests that this is a pretty robust effect, but it also means that because we have a convenience sample, our study in particular cannot generalize to a population outside of an introductory psychology class at Cotty College. So here's kind of an example from an article that I've written. So you kind of see here 31 undergraduates from the University of Missouri, 12 male, 19 female, took part in the experiment in exchange for credit in an introductory psychology course. So this is another thing we'll mention, that they participated for extra credit. All participants reported normal or corrected to normal vision and were not colorblind. This is also potentially going to be very important here. We need to make sure that so we're giving visual materials on a projector. So we need to make sure that our participants have either normal vision or corrected to normal vision. So they either wear contact lenses like me or they wear glasses. We do not necessarily have to mention anything about color blindness because we are not going to be actually looking at colors. Additionally, one of the things, depending on certain circumstances, you may remove certain participants from further analysis, and you need to mention that in your participants section. So for example, in this study, all of our participants were required to meet a minimum certain number of trials so that we could analyze their data. We were looking at speed of responding, and that only works if you have a certain number of correct trials. One of our participants did not actually meet that criterion, and we chose not to include them in further analysis. In another study that I've done, I had a participant who I could not use their data because at the end of the study, they told me that they were colorblind. And unfortunately, my study had a lot of color stimuli. So that data would not be useful. You need to explain, if you have to remove anybody from further data analysis, you need to be sure that you tell why. You don't have to be super specific, but you do need to mention, why you removed them. So now we're going to go on to the apparatus and materials subsection. So you use this section, depending on your study, to describe the instruments or the materials that you used in your research. So we will not necessarily need apparatus. Apparatus is if you are presenting information on a computer or using a very specific computer program. Now, in some of the studies that I've done, I actually do a lot of my experiments through computer programs with very detailed instructions. In this case, apparatus would be appropriate. We are going to be presenting a list of words and questions related to those words. In those particular cases, materials is probably going to work better. We can talk about the question booklets that we're going to develop. We can talk about the word lists that are being used. Additionally, if you're doing a questionnaire or if you're doing a personality inventory of some kind, this is when you would also use materials. Now, one thing that I occasionally see, I realize I am kind of contradicting myself because I did say I want more details, not less. You do not have to mention that there were pencils or paper. Do mention the booklets, which you can read more about in Experiment 9 in Craik and Tulving, but you don't have to mention that the materials were pens and paper and things like that. The booklets and the word lists are going to be more important here. And you want to describe those measures or those instruments in very good detail. So here's another example from that same study that I mentioned before with participants. Now, I personally find I have an easier time when I combine my apparatus and procedure together. You may choose to keep apparatus or materials separate from your procedure. That is a personal choice and whatever works best for you. But I want to kind of read through this for you so you can get an idea of the kind of level of detail that you're going to need. Participants were tested one at a time in quiet booths. Each booth was equipped with a computer which presented the experiment via E' 2.0, so that's the computer program. All change detection trials followed the general procedure described below and illustrated in Figure 1. Following a 1,000 millisecond fixation, participants were shown an array of colored squares in random locations. The possible locations that were randomly selected subtended a 6.09 times 4.74 centimeter invisible rectangular grid, with the center of the computer screen also functioning as the center of the grid. The number of squares within each array ranged from 1 to 6. Each square measured 0.5 by 0.5 centimeters and subtended 0.7 by 0.7 degrees of visual angle. So that's how much space it took on the retina. The minimal distance between squares in the array was 1.53 centimeters. And by the way, y'all, I actually had to get that measurement by pausing, getting a screenshot, and holding up a ruler and actually physically measuring it. Fun times. Within each array, each square color was randomly selected from a pool of 10 possible colors and was not used more than once within that array. The pool of colors included black, white, red, green, blue, purple, yellow, cyan, orange, and teal. The array of squares was presented for 500 milliseconds, which was followed by a blank retention period of 1,000 milliseconds. A single item probe immediately followed that retention interval and either matched a color present in the initial array, old probes, or changed to a unique color absent from the array, new probes. Participants were instructed to indicate whether a probe color was present or absent from the array with a key press. So you can kind of see the level of detail. Now with ours, because we're looking at word lists and booklets with questions, you are not going to need to be this detailed. You do not need to report how much visual angle the projector took up and the words on the projector took up on participants' retinas. We don't necessarily need that here, but I wanted to kind of show you some of the different levels of detail involved. So here's another one looking at health. And this is a kind of a materials section by Sasbo and colleagues in 2011. And you can kind of see a couple of examples here. So demographic characteristics and health conditions. So we'd find that in a materials section. Participants completed a short questionnaire assessing basic demographic characteristics such as sex, age, education, marital status and race, and self-reported health condition. From the latter, a measure of cardiovascular history was constructed. Conditions such as being diagnosed with coronary artery disease, peripheral vascular disease, experiencing shortness of breath, heart rhythm disorders, high cholesterol levels, and diabetes were checked as yes or no, and all positive responses were totaled to provide a measure of cardiovascular health. Presence of hypertension was indicated as a yes or no response to the question of whether the participant had high blood pressure. Unfortunately, we have no evidence as to whether participants' blood pressure was controlled or not. So what that kind of leads me to believe is that they did not include that question on the questionnaire, and they might have received questions from reviewers asking, did we look at that? And they're kind of saying, no, we didn't. But you can kind of see the level of detail here in this questionnaire as well. So then we go to the procedure. So you actually at this point describe how you collected the data. This will include information about the setting, paperwork, if there were consent procedures, you need to mention that, instructions that you gave to participants. Additionally, if you had a criterion for including people or excluding people from analysis, this is the perfect place to mention it. And in general, spelling everything out is going to be your best bet. A reader should be able to read this and for the most part be able or feel confident enough to actually reproduce that thing that you wrote. So they should be able to reproduce the experiment that you have described. So it is very much a type of procedural writing. So here's an example from Erickson and colleagues looking at expertise, practice, and music playing. So this is from Erickson and colleagues, 1993. The data collection procedures for the best and good violinists and the music teachers were identical. The first part of the procedure for the middle-aged violinists, from which data are reported, was the same as for 3 groups of young violinists. Each young violinist was interviewed during 3 sessions. During the first session, biographical information was obtained including the start of practice, sequence of music teachers, and participation in competitions. The subjects were then asked to estimate how many hours per week they had practiced alone with violin for each year since they had started to practice. So we have very clear instructions for how these interview questions were sequenced. Each subject was then given instructions about a taxonomy of activities. 10 categories of everyday activities were presented, each with a general label and a description and a listing of frequent examples. From extensive pilot work, 12 categories of musical activities were identified and similarly presented. For those subjects playing other instruments besides the violin, the 8 musical categories for playing an instrument were split into activities involving the violin and activities involving all other instruments. After presentation of the taxonomy, subjects were asked to estimate how much time they spent on each time of activity during the most recent typical week. Subjects were asked to rate each of the activities on 3 dimensions from a scale of 0 to 10. First, they were asked to rate the relevance of the activity to improving performance on the violin. Next, they were asked to rate the effort required to perform the activity. And then finally, they were asked to rate how enjoyable the activity was without considering their evaluation of the result of activity. For example, it is possible to enjoy the result of having cleaned one's house without enjoying the activity of cleaning. So that's a very, very good example and kind of explaining why it's there. So here's kind of another one from one of mine, and I'm going to go ahead and skip this one because it looks very similar to the apparatus, stimuli, and procedure that I showed you previously with the colored squares. The same sort of ideas apply here. So here are a couple of other things and tips for writing this section and some stylistic issues to consider. So I hope you are doing this regardless of what section you are writing, but this is another instance where considering your audience is going to be critical. We are doing something very simple for our class study. We're showing people lists of words. Depending on the booklet they are getting, they are either looking at questions about, is this an uppercase or lowercase? Does it rhyme with this word, or does it fit a category? So it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty simple. But what if your next write-up involves a study that's more complex, like the kind of things that I do? BEM, back in the Complete Academic, which I frequently consult when I talk about writing, is basically treating your reader as if they were a participant. So give your overview, describe your participants, describe your materials, and then after that, I personally do not do this, but you would be okay to do this. Avoid second person. Don't put it in you, but you might want to describe the procedure from the participant's point of view. So think about a participant coming in and taking part in this study and sequence the order of events. So include information about instructions or summaries that you're giving. Give important details about the setting. Include sample questions or materials. More information is always going to be better. So think about it this way, as Bem kind of puts it. Thus, it is more important to describe the schedules of reinforcement and the inner dimensions of the Skinner box, what the animal actually experienced, than its outer dimensions and the voltage of the power supply. Now, you might want to put that in there, but honestly, the more important things are the former, what the participant is actually experiencing. Now, when you write your method section, you might want to label groups or variables or different operations or different factors. Give them easy labels and be consistent with their use. So, for example, I want to go back really quick to the method section, or the section that I wrote in my paper from 2014. So you'll notice here that I mentioned old probes and I mentioned new probes. So here's something kind of interesting. When I first wrote that paper, I used target present and target absent. So target present meant that a color that they saw in the array was probed. Target absent meant that they got a new color. And I submitted the paper. I got a lot of good feedback on the paper, but one thing that the reviewers mentioned was that the use of target present and target absent was very, very confusing for them. What's a lot easier for them is old versus new. So old implies that this is something that you've seen before when you're tested on it. New implies that it's new. And that's a lot easier than target present or target absent. You have to think about it a little more when you think about it that way. Additionally, don't use abbreviations like these. The only one who is going to understand that abbreviation is you. Additionally, don't use empty labels. Group 2. Well, great. What does Group 2 do? And what's the difference between Group 2 and Group 1? You haven't told us. Generally, focus on labels with operational definitions in mind than these conceptual labels. And I'd even argue that target present and target absent is much more conceptual. Old versus new is much more of an operational definition here. So use good labels, make sure that people understand what they mean, and be consistent. Now, what else should be in a method section? If you're presenting data, if you're doing an observational study, that should include inner observer reliability measures. You want to make sure that your audience knows that you had raters. They agree with each other. Any psychometrics, including things like test, retest reliability, if you're doing that, any Cronbach's alpha to make sure that your questions kind of fit and are consistent with other measures of the same type. So if you're trying a new extroversion measure, it would be a good chance for you to kind of see if the Cronbach's alpha is similar to what you would find in a big 5 factor. So do those correlate with each other? If you're doing a survey, a return rate, a response rate, cooperation rates, those are important. Any discarded participants, please include how many and why, but not too much detail. So for example, there have been some times where due to a programming error, I'm not able to use somebody's data. I can say computer error is sufficient. I don't have to be like, I had to discard this participant because I wrote a bad program or I made a coding fault. Computer error or computer glitch will be sufficient. And one more thing, if this helps you, you either can include this at the end of your method section or you can include it at the beginning of your results and discussion section. You should try or think about including a quick summary of the procedure at the end and the overall purpose. So somebody who is not knowledgeable in psychology or is not as advanced as you should be able to skip most of the method section, read the final paragraph, and then be able to get back on track. So that's kind of something to think about. Now, really quick, I do want to go over a few other websites that kind of talk about writing an APA methods section. So I found this on Scribr, and they also have a few examples. You can see the go away pop-up. We don't need you. You can kind of see the web address here. But you can kind of see that structuring the methods section, and this is kind of based on 7th edition guidelines. The main heading of methods should be centered, bold-faced, and capitalized. Only capitalize the M in method. Don't do all caps. Don't yell at me. Subheadings are going to be left align, bold-faced, and in title case. You can also add lower level headings with subsections. Make sure that you're following those APA guidelines for headings. If you need some help with that, either feel free to go to the Writing Center or feel free to talk to me. So we have our participants, our materials. Again, if you're doing a computer program, Apparatus is sufficient, or procedure. So we can include participant characteristics, sampling procedures. Definitely include your sample size, and if you have power estimates of how much statistical power you have, you would include that here. We are not really going to talk about statistical power this semester. We will talk about it next semester, but you do not need to include it in our paper. Materials, those are going to be your primary measurements, questionnaires, surveys, word lists, computer programs, stimuli, etc., as well as the quality of those measurements. So that might include Cronbach's alpha, inner rater reliability, test-retest reliability, and things like that. Data collection methods, research design, data processing and diagnostics. Do you have outliers? How are you planning on getting rid of them? And your data analysis strategy. Now, not all of these are going to be relevant. We are not really going to be removing data from participants, I don't think. And so because of that, we don't really need to worry about that here. We also have guidelines for different types of research designs, longitudinal designs, replication studies. We don't really need to worry about that here. So participants, we're going to start by reporting sample characteristics, sampling procedures, and sample size. Generally, I tend to prefer use of the word participants rather than subjects. Subjects are typically what we use for animals. Participants imply voluntary consent, and that tends to be the term we prefer. Specify all relevant demographic characteristics. So some of these demographics are going to be relevant, some are not. So the key word here is going to be relevant. So under certain circumstances, it might be really important to record things like race or ethnicity. If you're doing any NIH funded research, I know for a fact that you actually have to report those demographics. And especially over the past couple of years, there have been those requirements. We do not necessarily need to do that here because we are not looking at race or ethnicity as a potential variable or factor of interest. We can include things like age if we record that data. Education level will matter less because everybody is in college. So one thing that you will kind of mention, depending on your study topic, characteristics like education, immigration status, language preference, or language ability might be important. So we might want to, for example, since we're having people look at words, and in particular in our deep processing case, we're asking people what words mean or thinking about those categories, it might be helpful to have a question relating to, are you a native English speaker? Do you have English as a learned language or things like that? Because we are going to be presenting words in English. We need to make sure that people can understand them. So we might want to include that. Report these as precisely as possible. This helps the reader understand how far your results may be generalized to other people. Make sure that you use bias-free language. So for example, the participants included 134 cisgender men between 18 and 25 years old. Again, gender identity is probably not going to be important for our study, so we do not necessarily have to report it. Sampling procedures will also be important. Sample size and statistical power, and feel free to look on this website. I'm going to only look through a few things. Primary and secondary measures specify all instruments. To cite hardware, indicate the model number, manufacturer. To cite common software, state the full name with the version or the website URL. To cite test scales or inventories, reference the manual or the article that it's published in. State the number of items or provide one or two examples. So in our case, our word lists directly come from Craik and Tulving Experiment 9. We need to make sure that that's mentioned. I have not looked at the distractor words for the recognition test. So for at least right now, before I find those, you are welcome to put in whatever distractor words or how we got them in whatever way you want. For each instrument used, report measures of reliability, something like internal consistency, which we measure with that Cronbach's alpha, or retest reliability. With validity, that could be construct validity or measures of criterion validity. And you see an example here of mentioning Cronbach's alpha, internal consistency as well. The quality of measurements, so did you have to train people? Did you have multiple people assessing? Did you use pilot studies? And then finally, you do your procedure. We are not doing multi-group studies, so we don't really have to worry about this. Let me see if there's anything else we need. Diagnostics, again, I do not foresee us removing any outliers, normalizing distributions, or dealing with missing values. And then finally, you do have some frequently asked questions. What tense should I write the method section in? Report methods in the past tense, even if you haven't completed your study, because the method section is intended to describe actions or research. Where does the methodology section go? It always comes after the introduction and before the results, discussion, and conclusion. Depending on the length and type of document, you may also include a literature review or a theoretical framework. We don't really need that here. And then finally, I realize this has been a little long. I want to go over the rubric with you. So again, as you're going to kind of see, the majority of the grade comes from content. So this is for the second draft of your methods rubric. This will be, again, 50 points. It's due April 22nd. So you have a lot of time to think about this. But the majority of the content, we don't need to change that tab. A papers, so it's 40% is due to content. A papers will have the following qualities. The description of the study is clear enough that exact replication is possible. So I should be able to read this and set it up exactly as you describe with no details missing or anything that's vague. Appropriate discussion of the study's participants, their characteristics where relevant, and how the sample was selected. All materials and equipment are clearly listed and described. All steps of the procedure are included. Where relevant, all experimental groups or conditions appropriately explained, including assignment to conditions. 30% goes toward organization. So again, label your sections appropriately. Paragraphs, again, are going to be well organized and constructed with a funneling approach. That first sentence should basically tell me everything that's going to go on within this paragraph. And then we use the last sentence of the paragraph to transition to the next paragraph. We need to have clear and smooth transitions between paragraphs. And then finally, style and formatting. Make sure that font, headings, margins, citations, basically fit with APA formatting. Sentences are clear and precise. You can follow the ideas that are presented. This needs to be formally written. No colloquialisms, no jargon, no contractions. Keep it formal. So hopefully this helps you out. Let me know if you have any questions on writing this, and I'm more than happy to send resources. Don't forget, I have a copy of the 7th edition of the APA manual. You are more than welcome to borrow my copy if you need it. But hopefully this kind of helps you out, and I will see you next time.